The scent of lilies and old, polished wood filled the air, a sweet and sacred perfume that usually brought Alara a sense of profound peace. Today, however, it felt suffocating, each breath a heavy, cloying weight in her chest. The church was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, with light filtering through stained glass windows, painting the stone floors in jewels of ruby and sapphire. Every pew was filled with the soft rustle of formal wear and the hushed, happy murmurs of guests. They were all here for Amelia's wedding, her husband Marcus's younger sister, and the air buzzed with joyful anticipation. Alara had poured her heart into this day, treating Amelia's wedding as if it were her own. She had spent countless evenings addressing invitations until her calligraphy pen felt like a permanent extension of her fingers, and she had tasted so many wedding cakes that the mere thought of buttercream now made her stomach churn. She did it all with a genuine love, for the woman who she hoped one day would feel less like a sister-in-law and more like a sister of her own. She spotted Marcus in the front pew standing beside his parents, looking strikingly handsome in his tailored suit. He was the epitome of the proud older brother, his posture straight, his expression serious but content. A small, relieved smile touched Alara's lips as she began her walk down the long aisle, her heels clicking a soft, apologetic rhythm on the ancient stone. She was running a few minutes late, a fact that coiled guilt in her stomach. She'd had to make a last-minute dash to the reception hall to handle a near crisis with the caterers, a detailed task involving seating charts and allergy lists that Marcus had assured her he'd handled, but had, as usual, forgotten. She reached the front pew, her eyes locking with his, a loving apology already forming on her lips. She was ready to slide in beside him, to take his hand and feel the familiar, grounding warmth of his grip. But the look on his face stopped her cold. It was a mask of ice. There was no warmth, no welcome, not even a flicker of recognition in his eyes. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle twitching in his cheek. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a clear, brutal signal. Then he shifted his body, angling himself away from the empty space beside him, the space that was rightfully hers. He was creating a physical barrier, a wall of tailored wool and cold indifference. It was a small, subtle gesture, one that an outsider might miss. But for Alara, it was a public execution, a silent, vicious declaration shouted in the sacred quiet of the church. He did not want her there. Not with his family, not with him. The blood drained from her face, replaced by a tidal wave of heat and shame that prickled at her skin. Her breath hitched, trapped in her throat. Suddenly, the hundreds of smiling guests felt like a jury, and she was the one on trial. She could feel their eyes on her, their gentle whispers twisting in her mind into harsh, mocking judgments. Why is she standing there? Where is she going? She was the wife, a partner of 10 years, yet she was being turned away like a stranger, an unwelcome guest. The sheer, nonsensical cruelty of it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. Swallowing the lump in her throat, a painful, jagged thing, she forced her legs to move. Her body felt disconnected, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life. She turned away from the front row, from the stony face of her husband, and walked back up the aisle. Each step was a monumental effort, her gaze fixed on the blur of the stone floor to avoid catching anyone's eye. She found a seat in the very last pew, tucked away in a shadowed corner where she prayed she could simply disappear into the ancient woodwork. She sank onto the cold, hard bench, her entire body trembling with a mixture of shock and a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow. The magnificent organ, which had been playing a soft prelude, swelled to life, signaling the start of the bridal march. As one, the congregation stood, their faces turning to watch Amelia, a radiant vision in white, begin her procession. Alara stood with them, a ghost at the feast, her heart fracturing with every graceful step the bride took toward the altar. Marcus had now moved to the front to stand with the groomsmen, his back straight and proud. He was playing the part of the devoted brother, the man of honor, while having just committed the most dishonorable act against his own wife. The ceremony began. The priest, a kind-faced man with wise, gentle eyes, spoke of the sanctity of marriage. He spoke of love, of unwavering partnership, of the sacred vow to stand by one another in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow. Each word, each beautiful sentiment, was a fresh dagger in Alara's heart. Sorrow. She was drowning in it. Sickness. She felt sick to her soul. Partnership. What partnership? He had just declared in front of everyone they knew that they were not partners. They were not even friends. Tears she hadn't realized were gathering finally welled over and streamed down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable. They weren't gentle, happy tears for the beautiful bride. They were tears of utter desolation, of grief for the death of her own marriage, a marriage she now saw was not just broken, but a carefully constructed lie. She tried to stifle her sobs, pressing a hand to her mouth, but a small, choked sound escaped her lips, a raw note of pain in the otherwise serene atmosphere. The priest paused. His sermon on love and fidelity faltered for a fraction of a second. His gaze, full of compassion, scanned the congregation, searching for the source of the distress. It swept past the smiling faces until it landed on her, huddled in the back, her shoulders shaking. The church fell utterly silent. Even the distant sound of city traffic seemed to fade away. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, his duty to the ceremony at war with the human compassion in his eyes. But her pain was too raw, too palpable to be ignored. In a soft yet clear voice that carried with surprising resonance through the silent church, he asked the question that would shatter her carefully composed facade and change everything. "My child," he said, his expression one of pure, gentle concern. "Why are you crying?" The priest's question hung in the cavernous silence of the church, echoing in the space between the vaulted ceilings and the stunned faces of the congregation. For a heart-stopping moment, it felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Every head, which had been respectfully turned toward the altar, now swiveled in her direction. A sea of faces, friends, distant relatives, colleagues, all stared at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, pity, and morbid fascination. The soft, joyful atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. Alara felt like an animal caught in the glare of 100 headlights, pinned down by the weight of their collective gaze. Her first instinct was to flee, to run out of the heavy oak doors and never look back. The shame was a physical force, a burning cloak that threatened to incinerate her. From the front of the church, she could feel a different kind of energy radiating, something cold and sharp. She didn't need to see Marcus's face to know his reaction. She could feel his fury across the distance, a palpable wave of rage directed squarely at her for creating a scene. She could picture his mother, a woman who valued appearances above all else, shooting daggers at her with her eyes, her perfectly composed face now a mask of horror and indignation. Amelia, the bride, stood frozen at the altar, her joyous day now tainted by this inexplicable family drama. Alara's heart ached for her, a pang of guilt piercing through her own storm of misery. This wasn't fair to Amelia. None of this was. But the priest's eyes held her. They were not judging. They were not intrusive. They were simply open, offering a quiet, unexpected sanctuary. His question had not been an accusation. It had been an invitation, an opportunity to give voice to a pain so immense it was threatening to tear her apart from the inside. For 10 years, she had been the perfect wife, the supportive partner, the woman who smoothed over Marcus's sharp edges and absorbed his casual cruelties with a patient smile. She had swallowed her feelings, buried her needs, and silenced her own voice for the sake of a peaceful life, for the sake of the man she loved, or at least the man she thought she loved. In that moment, under the gentle gaze of a stranger, something inside her snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, seismic shift. The years of accumulated hurts, the 1,000 tiny paper cuts to her soul, coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. Her silence had been her cage. By refusing to cause a scene, she had allowed her life to become one. Marcus had counted on that silence. He had stood in this holy place before God and everyone they knew, and banked on the fact that his wife would be too ashamed, too well-mannered, too broken to do anything but retreat quietly into the shadows. He had been right. She had. But the priest's question had unknowingly handed her a key. Her trembling stopped. A strange, unfamiliar calm settled over her. It was the calm of a person who has already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. Her gaze lifted from the floor and met the priest's directly. Her voice, when it came, was not a sob or a whisper, but a clear, steady tone that carried through the silent church with devastating simplicity. "I'm crying, Father," she said, her words precise and deliberate, "because I just realized my marriage is over." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. It was a soft, sibilant sound, like the wind rustling through dead leaves. She continued, not looking at Marcus, but keeping her eyes on the priest, the only person in the room who seemed to see her instead of the spectacle she was creating. "I'm crying because the man I have loved and supported for a decade, the man standing up there as a symbol of family and honor, refused to let me sit beside him today." She finally allowed her gaze to drift to the front row, to the space beside her husband where she was meant to be. He looked at me with contempt and turned me away in front of his entire family. So I am sitting back here, alone, because my husband made it clear that I am not welcome. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and heavy with the weight of her revelation. The truth, now spoken, could not be taken back. It filled the sacred space, dismantling the carefully constructed facade of the perfect family. Amelia let out a small, wounded cry, and the groom put a comforting arm around her. Marcus's father was staring at the floor, his face ashen. His mother's face was a thundercloud of fury. And Marcus had finally turned. He was looking at her, and the ice in his eyes had been replaced by a raging fire of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a look that confirmed everything. There was no love there. Perhaps there never had been. The priest's kind face was etched with sorrow. He looked from Alara to Marcus, then to the stunned bride and groom at the altar. The wedding had been irrevocably broken, the joyous union shattered by a truth that had refused to stay silent any longer. He cleared his throat, his authority a gentle but firm presence in the chaos. Perhaps, the priest said softly, his voice full of compassion, we should take a brief pause. The priest's words, take a brief pause, were a lifeline thrown into a sea of chaos. It was a gentle command, but it broke the spell of horrified silence. A low, nervous murmur swept through the church as people began to whisper, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They turned to their neighbors, their faces a canvas of shock and confusion. The organist, after a moment of stunned hesitation, began to play a soft, somber melody, a funereal tune that was grotesquely out of place at a wedding. It was the sound of a beautiful day dying. Alara didn't wait to see what would happen next. She didn't wait for the inevitable confrontation, for Marcus's mother to march down the aisle and hiss venom at her, or for Marcus himself to drag her outside for a furious lecture on how she had humiliated him. She had done her part. She had spoken her truth. Staying for the fallout felt like waiting around to be punished for it, and she was done with that. With a strange sense of detachment, as if she were floating outside her own body, she stood up from the back pew. She turned her back on the wedding, on her husband, on the entire life that had just imploded, and walked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the church. She didn't run. Her steps were measured and deliberate. The click of her heels on the stone floor was the only sound that seemed to matter, a steady rhythm marking her exit. With every step, she felt the weight of 10 years of silent compromises and stifled tears begin to lift from her shoulders. She pushed the door open, and the bright, indifferent afternoon sunlight spilled in, making her blink. Then she stepped outside, and the door swung shut behind her, muffling the chaos within. The cool air felt like a balm on her hot, tear-stained cheeks. She stood on the church steps, breathing it in, the scent of city traffic and rain-washed pavement replacing the suffocating perfume of lilies. And as she stood there, the memories came flooding back, not as a confusing jumble, but with a sudden, painful clarity. She remembered meeting Marcus at a university fundraiser. He had been magnetic, his laughter loud and confident, his ambition a dazzling force that drew people into his orbit. He had pursued her with a relentless charm, making her feel like the only person in the world. He made grand gestures, recited poetry, and promised her a life filled with adventure and success. And Alara, who had always been quieter and more introspective, was swept away by the sheer force of his personality. She had mistaken his arrogance for confidence, his possessiveness for passion. The first few years had been good, or so she had told herself. They were a power couple, or at least that's what he called them. He was the power, she was the couple. His career in finance took off, and she, a talented graphic designer, put her own freelance ambitions on the back burner to support his rise. She hosted dinner parties for his clients, remembered the names of their children, and proofread his reports late into the night. She was the silent partner in the Marcus brand, and for a while, being the woman behind the successful man had been enough. But the shift had been insidious, a slow erosion of her identity that she barely noticed until it was too late. The charming jokes he made at her expense in front of friends slowly acquired a sharper, more cruel edge. "Ilara's a dreamer," he would say with a chuckle when she talked about wanting to open her own design studio. "Good thing one of us has their feet on the ground." Her opinions on politics, on art, on literature, were first gently debated, then condescendingly dismissed, and finally simply ignored. He called it playing devil's advocate. She now realized he was just being the devil. His family, especially his mother, Eleanor, had never thought Alara was good enough. Eleanor saw her as a pretty but ultimately unsubstantial accessory for her brilliant son. At family gatherings, her accomplishments were overlooked, her conversation topics subtly redirected, and her presence treated as incidental. Marcus never defended her. "That's just how my mom is," he would say with a shrug. "Don't be so sensitive." He taught her, through his inaction, that her feelings were an overreaction, an inconvenience. One year, on their 7th anniversary, she had booked a table at the restaurant where he had first proposed. She waited for 2 hours, sipping water and enduring the pitying looks of the waiter, before a text message finally arrived. "Got held up at work. Rain check?" He walked in the door hours later, not with an apology, but with a complaint about his stressful day. When he saw her tear-streaked face, he sighed with exasperation. "Oh, come on, Alara, it's just a dinner. You know how important my work is. Don't be so dramatic." She had spent the rest of the night comforting him. Standing on the church steps, that memory burned with a fresh shame. It hadn't been an oversight. It had been a statement of priorities. His work was important. She was not. His stress was valid. Her hurt was dramatic. That had been the unspoken contract of their marriage. The scene at the wedding was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of 1,000 such moments. He hadn't just refused her a seat. He had, for years, refused her a place of equal standing in their life together. He had pushed her into the background so consistently that he felt entitled to do it literally in front of the world. She finally understood. Her tears in the church weren't just for the public humiliation. They were tears of mourning for the woman she had been when she first met him, a woman full of dreams and confidence, a woman he had systematically dismantled until all that was left was a quiet, accommodating shell. And today, that shell had finally cracked open. She took out her phone. Her hands were perfectly steady. She scrolled through her contacts, past husband, past Eleanor, and found the number she was looking for. She pressed the call button. "Hi," she said, her voice even. "I need to book a taxi, just one way." The taxi ride was a journey through a city that looked both familiar and completely alien. Alara sat perfectly still in the back seat, watching the world slide by beyond the window, a blur of bustling sidewalks, sun-drenched parks, and towering glass buildings. She didn't look back. She made a conscious choice not to glance in the rearview mirror, not to search for the distant steeple of the church she had just left behind. That part of her life was over, and looking back would feel like questioning a decision that was, in her bones, the most honest one she had ever made. The driver, a man with a kind face who had seen her tear-streaked cheeks and asked no questions, simply drove. The quiet hum of the engine a comforting, monotonous sound. Then, the inevitable happened. Her phone, tucked away in her small clutch, began to buzz. It was a frantic, angry vibration against her hip. She pulled it out. The screen was lit up with the word husband. She stared at it, her thumb hovering over the green accept icon. For a fleeting second, the old instincts kicked in. The urge to answer, to soothe, to manage his anger, to de-escalate the situation she had caused. For 10 years, that had been her primary role. But the woman who had answered his calls without question was the same woman who had been left in the back pew of the church. That woman was gone. She pressed the red decline button. The buzzing stopped. A moment later, it started again. Husband. She declined it again. Then came a text message, the preview flashing on her screen. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Call me now." The words were pure Marcus, a command, not a question, laced with the fury of a man whose control had been publicly challenged. Another call came through, this time from Eleanor. She declined it without hesitation. Then another, from Amelia. This one gave her a pang of guilt, but she knew that any conversation right now would be filtered through the lens of Marcus and his family's narrative, a story in which she would undoubtedly be cast as the villain. She couldn't face it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. With a deep breath, she held down the power button on the side of the phone. The screen prompted her. Power off? She pressed it without a second thought. The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute, a small, digital liberation that felt monumental. She had severed the leash. She leaned forward. "It's just a little further up, on the left," she told the driver, her voice surprisingly steady. She was guiding him to a part of the city she hadn't visited in at least 5 years, a grittier, more vibrant neighborhood known for its independent art galleries, quirky bookshops, and the scent of spray paint that seemed to permanently hang in the air. The taxi pulled up to a slightly dilapidated brick building with ivy creeping up its walls. This was it. She paid the driver, adding a generous tip for his unspoken kindness, and stepped onto the pavement. On her keychain, nestled amongst the key to her marital home and the key to her car, was a small, tarnished brass key she hadn't used in years. She had often wondered why she kept it. Now she knew. She had been keeping it for today. The key slid into the lock of the building's main entrance and turned with a satisfying metallic click. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and linseed oil. She walked up a single flight of creaky wooden stairs to a door marked Studio 3B. Her heart was pounding now, a mixture of trepidation and a strange, exhilarating hope. This was it. The key worked here, too. She pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted her stole her breath away. The studio was just as she had left it, a perfect time capsule of the person she had been before her life became entirely about Marcus. Everything was draped in white dust cloths, giving the room a ghostly, ethereal quality. They covered a large easel in the center, a drafting table by the window, and shelves crammed with books and supplies. It was a space frozen in time, a monument to the ambitions she had been gently, expertly convinced to abandon. The air was stale, but to Alara it was the smell of freedom. Slowly, reverently, she walked to the center of the room and pulled the dust cloth off the easel. Underneath sat a half-finished canvas, an abstract swirl of deep blues and vibrant greens. She remembered the feeling of painting it, the joy of getting lost in the colors, the frustration and excitement of trying to bring an idea to life. It was the last piece she had worked on before Marcus had convinced her that the studio was an unnecessary luxury and that she could easily work from a small corner in their sterile, minimalist house. Of course, in that house, surrounded by his taste and his life, her inspiration had withered and died. A wave of emotion washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. It wasn't just sadness, it was a profound grief for the years she had lost, for the passion she had allowed to be extinguished. But threaded through the grief was something else, something new and powerful: resolve. This place, this dusty, forgotten room was hers. It was the one part of her life that Marcus hadn't managed to taint or control. He had only convinced her to cover it up and walk away. She moved to the window, pulling back another cloth to reveal her old drafting table. The wood underneath was scarred with nicks from X-Acto knives and stained with rings of coffee and splatters of ink. She ran her hand over the textured surface. It felt real, solid. It felt more like home than the polished marble countertops of her marital house ever had. Looking around at the silent, waiting potential of the room, Alara felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in a decade. She wasn't just a scorned wife running from a failed marriage. She was an artist, standing in her studio. She wasn't defined by the man who had just humiliated her. She was defined by the work she had yet to create. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like Mrs. Alara Vance. She just felt like Alara. And in the quiet of that dusty room, that was more than enough. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. Alara didn't leave the studio. She ordered groceries online, had them delivered to the building's front door, and existed solely within the four walls of her rediscovered sanctuary. The first day was spent cleaning. With every sweep of the broom, with every wipe of a dusty surface, she felt she was not just cleaning a room, but clearing the clutter from her own soul. She washed the dust cloths and hung them to dry, letting the sunlight and fresh air do their work. She organized her old paint tubes, uncapped dried-out markers, and sharpened pencils that hadn't been touched in a decade. Each small, methodical task was an act of reclaiming herself. On the third day, she turned her phone back on. The barrage was immediate. Dozens of missed calls from Marcus, his parents, and a few of his friends. There was a string of text messages, a perfect chronicle of his escalating rage. They began with commands. "You've made your point. Now come home." Shifted to threats. "If you don't answer this phone, you'll regret it." Then descended into a kind of desperate, manipulative pleading. "Alara, I miss you. This is all a misunderstanding. Please come back." For the first time, she saw his tactics for what they were. Not expressions of love or concern, but the frantic thrashings of a puppeteer who had just dropped all his strings. She read them all, not with pain, but with the detached interest of a researcher studying a foreign species. Then, calmly, she blocked his number. She blocked his mother's. She kept Amelia's, but she wasn't ready to talk yet. He found her on the 5th day. She was standing at her easel, a new, large canvas propped up, the first bold strokes of charcoal sketching out a new beginning. A loud, insistent banging on the studio door made her jump. She knew instantly who it was. The old Alara would have frozen, her heart pounding with dread. The new Alara put down her charcoal, wiped her hands on a rag, and walked calmly to the door. She opened it to find Marcus standing there, his expensive suit rumpled, his hair a mess. He looked exhausted, but the fury in his eyes was fresh. "There you are," he breathed, a mixture of relief and anger. He tried to push past her into the studio, into her space, but she didn't move. She stood her ground, one hand on the door, blocking his entry. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked. Her voice was even, devoid of the emotion he was expecting. His face contorted in disbelief. "What do I want? I want to know what you think you're doing. You humiliated me. You humiliated my family. You ruined my sister's wedding and then you just disappear? You owe me an explanation." Alara looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. He still didn't get it. He never would. "No, Marcus," she said softly. "I don't owe you anything. For 10 years, I gave you everything. My time, my dreams, my support, my silence. I built my life around you. And in return, you asked for more. You asked for me to be smaller, quieter, less than I was, so you could feel bigger. That's ridiculous," he scoffed. But there was a flicker of panic in his eyes. "Is it?" she countered. "At your sister's wedding, you asked me, without words, to disappear into the back of the church. You just finally did on the outside what you'd been doing to me on the inside for years. The only difference is that this time, someone noticed. The priest asked me why I was crying. But the real question, the one I've been asking myself in the studio for the last 5 days, is why I didn't start crying years ago." She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out her set of keys. She calmly slipped the key to their house and the key to her car off the ring, leaving only the single brass key to the studio. She held them out to him. "I'm not coming home," she said. "The woman you were married to, she doesn't exist anymore. I think she finally died in that back pew. I'm so sorry you had to find out that way." He stared at the keys in her palm, then back at her face, searching for the tearful, broken woman he knew how to manipulate. He couldn't find her. She was gone. All his anger, all his bluster, seemed to deflate, leaving behind a hollow, confused man. "Alara, please," he said, his voice dropping to the intimate whisper he used to use to get his way. "We can fix this." "No," she said, her voice full of a gentle, unshakable finality. "We can't. But I can fix me." She dropped the keys into his hand, and with a quiet, "Goodbye, Marcus," she closed the door, leaving him alone in the hallway. She didn't wait to hear his footsteps retreat. She walked back to her easel, picked up her piece of charcoal, and with a steady hand, she continued her work. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large studio window, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny dancing stars. The canvas before her was no longer blank. It was starting to fill with color, bold, vibrant, and unapologetically alive. It was a self-portrait, but not of her face. It was a portrait of her soul, finally breaking free. She didn't know what the future held, if she would be a successful artist, or where she would live next. But for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. The silence of the room wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. It was the sound of her own life, waiting to be lived. Sometimes, the most important questions are the ones we're most afraid to ask ourselves. "Why are you crying?" a kind stranger asked, and in answering that question honestly, Alara found her freedom. Her story is a powerful reminder that we should never make ourselves small to fit into someone else's world. Your voice matters, your dreams have value, and your happiness should never be an inconvenience. If you feel you are sitting in the back pew of your own life, perhaps it is time to ask yourself why, and to find the courage to walk out that door and into the sunshine. You deserve a life that has a seat for you right at the very front.